If you want to start making games, you need to know about variables, as they are used in probably every game you've ever played. By the end of this video, you will completely understand what they are and how you use them in Unreal Engine. And it's actually incredibly easy. So let's get right into it. In my last video, I briefly explained that variables are containers stored with data. This can be a number, some text, a location, or anything really. There's hundreds and maybe even thousands of variables you can choose from in Unreal Engine, but don't worry, later in the video I'll share the most common variable types that I use all the time. You can simply create a variable for an actor under the variables panel. Give it a name and specify the type. To get or set your variable, you simply drag it into the event graph, or Ctrl drag for getting a variable and Alt drag for setting a variable. Now you know how to create, get, and set variables, it's time to show you the most common variable types I use for making games in Unreal Engine. The variable type I use the most are booleans. This variable can be either on or off. It's basically a light switch, and I often pair this up with a branch. Then we have number variables. For whole numbers without a decimal you use an integer, and for numbers with a decimal you use a float. For text variables you have three types: name, string, and text. I used to only work with strings, but by doing some research I found out that strings are actually only used for text that is edited. Names are used for text that won't be edited, and text is used for text that is displayed to the player, like UI, since this type makes localization easy. The last type of variables are location variables. The vector variable takes a x, y, and z input to define a spot in the world, and a transform variable is used not just for location but also rotation and scale. I often use a vector variable, but rarely use a transform variable. Alright, so I said that was the last variable type, but the actual last variable type I'm covering is a subscribe variable. I use this all the time, and you should try it too. To show you an example of how to use variables, I created a simple pickup system where you collect coins. In the player blueprint, I created an integer called collectible. This is your container that I talked about. In the details panel, you can set the default value it starts with. In our case, that's 0. Then, after I interact with one of these collectibles, it will increase the collectibles variable by 1. As you might have noticed, I'm using the node with the 2 plus signs, as this just takes a number and adds 1 to it. You can also just use a normal add node and type 1 if you like that better. To top it off, I made a very basic UI for it that just reads the collectibles variable coming from the player. And there's not a whole lot to variables, but it's an essential topic you really need to understand if you want to start making games. In my last video, I also went over variables and many more nodes that you really need to know if you want to start making games in Unreal Engine, and you can check it out here.